My name is Claire Ridgway Donovan. I'm 42 years old, and I spend my days managing other people's inheritances for a living. I'm a senior trust officer at Larkin Private Bank, which means strangers pay me to make sure their money does what they wanted it to do after they're not around to enforce it themselves. I have sat across the table from widows discovering their husbands had secret debts, from siblings discovering they'd been quietly disinherited, from grown children discovering a parent's will had been rewritten 3 weeks before death by someone who had motive and opportunity. I thought I understood betrayal the way a surgeon understands a wound, professionally, at a careful distance, never expecting to be the one on the table. Then, on a Tuesday in February, a radiologist showed me a mass on a screen and used the word malignant, and 4 days later, while I was still deciding how to tell my 15-year-old daughter, I found a text message on a shared tablet that told me my husband had been living a second life for 3 years, one with its own apartment, its own routines, and it would turn out its own child. What I did next wasn't revenge, it was paperwork, that it was the most consequential paperwork of my life, and it started the same week I lost my hair. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the ones who look the calmest are usually the ones doing the most work behind the scenes. If you've ever had to protect yourself while the ground was already you'd expect from someone paying attention. But twice during that 40-minute appointment, his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket, and twice he glanced down at it, not obviously, but enough that I noticed, the way you noticed anything when your whole life has just tilted 6 degrees off its axis, and suddenly every small thing looks like it might be load-bearing. That night, packing for what I assumed would be an early surgical consult the next morning, Peter told me he had a client walk-through in Cleveland he couldn't reschedule, 3 hours away, an overnight trip, the kind of thing his contracting business required constantly, and I'd never once questioned in 11 years of marriage. I didn't question it that night either. I want to be honest that the version of me before all this trusted him completely, not out of naivety, but because 11 years is a long time to build a case for someone, and he'd never given me a reason to build one against him. The first contradiction came 4 days later, small enough that I almost let it go. Peter mentioned, in passing, that the Cleveland client had decided to postpone the whole renovation indefinitely, budget issues, nothing to do with him. I remembered, because I do this for a living, that he'd told me before the trip the client was ready to sign that week. A signed client doesn't postpone indefinitely 4 days after a site walkthrough without some kind of conversation happening in between, and there hadn't been one, or if there had, he hadn't mentioned it, and Peter mentions everything about his business, usually more than I want to hear. I filed it away the way you file away a typo on an otherwise clean document, a small thing, probably nothing, and went back to reading about lumpectomy recovery timelines, because that was the emergency my brain had decided to focus on. The first hidden detail found me by accident, the way most of the real ones do. Peter and I shared a family tablet that lived on the kitchen counter, used mostly for grocery lists and Sophie's school calendar, and it was still logged into his messaging account from a software update he'd done on it months earlier and never signed out of. A notification banner slid across the screen while I was checking Sophie's soccer schedule, a name I didn't recognize, Renata, with a single red heart emoji, and the word "See you Thursday," and I stood there in my kitchen with a mixing bowl of grocery list ingredients, and told myself, immediately, instinctively, the way you protect yourself from a thought you're not ready to have, that it was probably a coworker, an inside joke, a wrong number even, anything other than what it obviously was. I didn't confront him that night. I told myself I had bigger things to deal with, a pre-op appointment in 2 days, a daughter to figure out how to tell, a trust review at work I'd have to hand off to a colleague during treatment. That was true. It was also, I recognize now, the first time in this story I chose to look directly at something because I was afraid of what looking would cost me, and I want to be honest about that instinct because it's the same instinct that let this go on as long as it did. Telling Sophie about the diagnosis happened before any of the rest of it, and it deserves its own space here because it was its own kind of turning point, one that had nothing to do with Peter at all. I sat her down at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, Peter beside me, and I used the words I'd rehearsed with Dr. Okonkwo's nurse navigator, breast cancer, treatable, stage 2, a plan already in motion. Sophie didn't cry right away. She asked, in the very specific way 15-year-olds ask the questions adults are too afraid to ask directly, whether I was going to die. I told her the honest answer, which was that the 5-year survival rate for what I had was good, better than good, but that I wasn't going to lie to her, and promise her certainty medicine can't actually offer anyone. She nodded, the way she does when she's filing something away to think about alone later, and asked if she could still go to Emma's birthday party that weekend. I remember being grateful for that question more than almost anything else that whole month, because it meant some part of her 15-year-old life was still allowed to be ordinary, and I promised myself, right there at that table, that I would protect as much of her ordinary life as I possibly could for as long as this took. The trust she thick came from an unlikely place, my sister-in-law Denise, Peter's own sister, who I'd always liked but never taken entirely seriously, because Denise says everything with the same breathless urgency, whether she's describing a house fire or a sale at the outlet mall. She called me the week before my surgery, ostensibly to check on me, and somewhere in the conversation, offhand, she mentioned that Peter had asked her, months earlier, whether she thought their father's old habit of keeping 2 households running had been hard on their mother financially, or just emotionally. It was such a strange, specific question to have asked his sister that I couldn't stop turning it over after we hung up. Peter's father, it turned out, had had a long affair decades earlier, one the family didn't discuss, one that had apparently drained money out of the marriage for years before anyone noticed. I'd been married to Peter for 11 years and never once heard that story until his sister mentioned it like a footnote, and I couldn't stop wondering why he'd been asking about it recently, and specifically, why he'd been asking about the financial part. The personal betrayal arrived 3 days before my surgery, and it arrived through a credit card statement, because that's the kind of person I am, the kind who reconciles the joint account even the week she's about to have a piece of her own body removed. There was a recurring charge I'd seen for 2 years without ever questioning it, $300 and $40 a month to something called Birchwood Property Management, which I'd always assumed was storage unit fees for his tools between jobs. I called the number on the statement, told them I was doing an insurance audit, standard enough cover for someone in my profession, and the woman on the phone confirmed, without hesitation, that the account was a 1-bedroom unit at Birchwood Commons, lease held by Peter Donovan, tenancy beginning 38 months earlier. 38 months, 3 years and 2 months, before I got sick, before anything about this year, before I had any reason at all to expect my life to need defending. I sat in my car in the bank parking garage, the same parking garage where, in a story I closed on months ago that feels like it belongs to someone else's life now, I once sat and learned my own family had tried to take my house. Some detail I can't explain kept surfacing in my mind that afternoon, which is that I had spent my whole career telling clients that the truth about a marriage is almost always visible in the money first, if you know how to read it, and I had somehow never once turned that same discipline on my own accounts, because I loved him, and love is the only ledger most of us refuse to audit. I pulled the full 18 months of statements that night after Sophie went to bed, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a laptop and a legal pad, doing to my own marriage exactly what I do for strangers every week at work. Hood charge wasn't the only thing that had been hiding in plain sight once I knew to look. There were cash withdrawals from an ATM near a strip mall I had no reason to associate with any of Peter's job sites, always in amounts just under $1,000, always on a Thursday. There was a gym membership at a facility 20 minutes from any house we'd ever lived in. None of it, on its own, would have meant anything to a person who wasn't already looking for a pattern. Together, laid out on a legal pad at 11 at night, it read like a second life with its own geography, its own weekly rhythm, entirely separate from the one I thought I shared with him. The first real consequence hit 2 days later, the day before my surgery, and it wasn't about Peter at all, not directly. It was about the paperwork he suddenly, urgently, wanted me to sign. He came home with a folder from our estate attorney's office, the same firm that had drafted our original wills and healthcare directives 9 years earlier when Sophie was born, and he said, gently, reasonably, that with surgery tomorrow and chemo coming, it just made sense to update my healthcare power of attorney and make sure the financial power of attorney was current too, so he could handle bills, and the mortgage, and the business account if I was too sick from treatment to deal with any of it. On its own, on any other week, this would have sounded like exactly what a good husband does. That's what made it so effective. I looked at that folder sitting on our kitchen table, 12 hours before I went under anesthesia. And some part of me, the trust officer part, the part that reads documents for a living and has learned to distrust convenient timing more than almost anything else, said not tonight. Let's do it after surgery when I can actually read it properly. And Peter's face did something small and controlled, a flicker of frustration he covered fast, that I filed away next to the Birchwood charge and the Cleveland client who postponed for no reason. The unexpected ally showed up 9 days after my surgery, while I was still recovering, in the form of a phone call from Ansel Whitcomb, the semi-retired attorney who had drafted my father's irrevocable family trust 15 years before he died. Ansel was in his 70s by then, mostly handed his practice off to younger partners, but he still personally reviewed the annual filings for a handful of legacy clients, my father's trust among them, out of what I think was genuine loyalty to a man he'd respected. He called to tell me, carefully, almost apologetically, that he'd noticed something odd in the trust's most recent custodial account statement, an authorized user addition he didn't recognize, dated back 14 months, that he wanted to flag before the annual filing went out. He asked if I'd added anyone new to the account. I told him no. He said, then someone else did, and I think you should come in when you're feeling up to it. I sat with that PA one call for a full day before I could bring myself to schedule the appointment, because some part of me already suspected before I had a single piece of proof that whatever Ansel had found was going to connect to everything else I'd been quietly cataloging on my legal pad: the Birchwood lease, the Thursday cash withdrawals, the gym membership 20 minutes from anywhere we'd ever lived. I went in 11 days post-surgery, still moving carefully, a drain still taped under my arm beneath my sweater, and Ansel met me at the door of his office himself instead of having Priya show me in, which told me before he said a word that whatever he found, he considered it serious enough to handle personally. I want to explain what my father's trust actually was, because it matters enormously to everything that came after. My father, Walter Ridgway, built a chain of 6 hardware stores across 2 counties, from a single location he'd inherited from his own father, and when he died 15 years ago, he didn't leave that money to me outright. He put it into an irrevocable trust, naming me as sole beneficiary, and unusually, as trustee myself once I turned 30, with one structural safeguard. Ansel had insisted on, and my father had agreed to without much discussion at the time. Any authorized signer added to the trust's investment accounts, or any distribution above a threshold amount, required a co-signature from an independent trust protector, a role Ansel himself had agreed to hold. A department already looking into it. I told myself the worst of it was contained, that the structural safeguard had held, that I could focus on finishing chemo and let the paperwork sort itself out quietly in the background the way these things sometimes do. I want to be honest that this was a false victory, because there was still a piece missing, and I didn't yet understand how large that missing piece actually was. The second betrayal came from Ansel's assistant, a meticulous young woman named Priya, who had pulled the full account history at Ansel's request, and who found, buried in the transaction log from 18 months earlier, several small test transfers, amounts under $500, moved out and then back in within days, the kind of thing someone does when they're checking whether a system will let a transaction through before they try something larger. Those small transfers had a memo field attached, auto-generated by the banking app, that listed a linked external account nickname, Renata M. Household. Not a coworker, not a wrong number. A household, linked to Peter, linked to a name I now recognized, existing in some financial relationship with my husband, stable and established enough to have its own account nickname 18 months before I ever found the text message on the tablet. I hired my own attorney the next week, a family law specialist named Corinne Achebe, who Ansel referred me to specifically because, he said, she doesn't flinch, and I needed someone who wouldn't flinch. Corinne moved quickly and quietly, the way Delia had once moved for me in an entirely different chapter of my life, and within 2 weeks, through the discovery process that begins the moment a family attorney sends a formal notice of representation. We had Peter's business bank statements for Donovan Build Group, subpoenaed as part of establishing marital asset value, and that's where the stakes stopped being about an apartment and started being about something structural. I want to describe what those weeks actually felt like, because the outside of my life looked almost normal during them, and that contrast is its own kind of exhausting. I went to chemo every other Tuesday, sat in a recliner with a warm blanket and a bag of saline dripping into a port under my collarbone, and made small talk with the nurses about Sophie's soccer season, while my phone buzzed quietly in my bag, with updates from Corinne's office about subpoenaed statements and forensic accounting timelines. I drove myself home for most of those infusions, because Peter had started, without my asking, being unusually attentive that spring, bringing home dinner, asking about my nausea levels, and I understood, once I'd seen the attorney consultation dates, that some of that attentiveness had less to do with love than with a man trying to look, on paper and in memory, like a devoted husband, in case any of this ever needed to be argued in front of a judge. The hidden motive sat in Ho's business statements in the form of a category of recurring expense labeled, in Peter's own bookkeeping, as vendor payments, roughly $2,200 a month, going out to an account that traced, through the same custodian's records Ansel had already flagged, to Renata M. Not gifts, not an affair funded out of pocket money, a structured, monthly, business-disguised support payment that had been running for close to 3 years, the exact length of the Birchwood Commons lease. Corinne pulled county property records next, the same kind of records I search every week for my own work, and found what none of us had expected yet: a birth certificate filed 16 months earlier for a child, father listed as Peter Donovan, mother Renata Marsh. He hadn't just been unfaithful, he had a second child, a toddler, and had been quietly funding a second household out of his construction business for 3 years, while I had no idea any of it existed. I had to decide in the middle of my 3rd chemo infusion, sitting in a recliner with a compression bag on my arm, whether to tell Sophie immediately or protect her through the end of her sophomore year first. I chose to wait, not out of cowardice, but because I understood something about timing that I don't think most people appreciate until they've lived it, which is that a child can survive almost any truth if it's delivered when there's enough stability around her to absorb it, and none of us had that stability yet. Was the hardest sacrifice of this whole ordeal, harder than the diagnosis itself in some ways, sitting across the dinner table from my daughter for 6 more weeks, watching her worry about my hair falling out, while I carried a second, larger secret about her father that I wasn't ready to hand her yet. The hidden history surfaced almost by accident, during a conversation with my own mother, who I finally told everything, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea neither of us drank. She said, quietly, that my father had asked her, years before he wrote that trust, whether she thought I had good judgment about people, and that when she'd said of course, he'd told her he still wanted the protector clause in there anyway, because good judgment doesn't stop someone from marrying a good man who becomes a different one over time. I hadn't known, until my mother told me that afternoon, that my father had specifically discussed the possibility of a future spouse mismanaging that money, 15 years before I'd even met Peter. He hadn't been protecting me from a person. He'd been protecting me from a category of risk he understood better than I did at 27, when the trust was drafted, because he'd watched it happen to other families his whole career running those hardware stores, and he'd built a wall for a threat he couldn't name in advance, but somehow anticipated anyway. My mother told me something else that afternoon that I've kept close ever since, which is that my father had once turned down a request from a longtime employee, a store manager he genuinely liked, to co-sign a loan using store inventory as collateral, and had told my mother afterward that the hardest part of loving people in business was learning to separate their character from their circumstances, because good people under enough financial pressure will sometimes do things that have nothing to do with who they actually are underneath it. I didn't know, sitting at that table, whether he'd extended Peter that same grudging understanding or not. I only knew that he'd built me a wall regardless of the answer, which felt in its own quiet way like the least sentimental and most complete expression of love I'd ever been given. The power shift became formal 3 weeks later, when Corinne filed for legal separation and, as part of that filing, formally revoked Peter's healthcare power of attorney and financial power of attorney, replacing both with my mother as backup and Corinne's office as the point of legal contact. I watched from a position I never expected to occupy, someone who had spent his marriage assuming he'd eventually control both my inheritance and my medical decisions, if it came to that, discover in a single afternoon that he now controlled neither, and that the structural safeguard my father had built into an irrevocable trust 15 years earlier meant the largest asset in play had never actually been vulnerable to him at all. No matter how good his forged signature was, the desperate countermove came exactly the way Corinne warned me it might. Peter's attorney sent a filing arguing that because I had been diagnosed with a serious illness and was undergoing chemotherapy at the time the separation was initiated and the powers of attorney revoked, the decisions had been made under diminished capacity or undue influence from my legal and financial advisors, and requested a competency evaluation before any further changes to our marital estate could proceed. I remember reading that filing at my kitchen table, bald from the second round of chemo, a wool cap pulled low against the draft from the window, and feeling something colder than anger settle into me, because he was trying to use the exact vulnerability he'd tried to exploit with the fraudulent authorization form 14 months earlier as a legal weapon a second time, arguing now that the sickness that made me an easy target also made me too impaired to protect myself from him. Corinne didn't panic, which steadied me more than any reassurance she could have said out loud. She told me competency evaluations requested this way rarely succeed when the person in question has, on the record, been actively employed, managing a licensed professional role at a bank, and communicating clearly with counsel throughout treatment, and she was right. My own oncologist, when asked to provide a letter for the record, wrote 3 sentences that ended up doing more work than anything Corinne or I could have argued ourselves, stating plainly that chemotherapy-related fatigue had at no point affected my cognitive function or decision-making capacity, and that I had continued working full-time throughout treatment without interruption. The competency filing was withdrawn within 3 weeks, quietly, the way weak legal arguments usually are, without an apology attached to the withdrawal, which told me everything about how seriously it had ever been meant as anything other than pressure. The missing evidence surfaced through Corinne's discovery process 2 weeks later, and it was the piece that changed how everyone, including me, understood the entire timeline. Peter's own attorney's billing records, produced as part of routine discovery, showed a first consultation dated 4 months before my diagnosis. 4 months before the biopsy, before the radiologist, before any of it. He hadn't been a man who found comfort in someone else after his wife got sick. He had already been consulting a divorce attorney about protecting his interests in a marriage he was quietly planning to leave, and then my diagnosis had happened, and instead of leaving, he had recalculated because a wife undergoing cancer treatment, a wife whose judgment could later be challenged as impaired, whose family trust he'd already tried once to access, was, in the coldest possible arithmetic, more valuable to stay married to during treatment than to divorce cleanly. The healthcare proxy request the night before my surgery hadn't been love, it had been logistics. The complete truth landed on me slowly, over the course of an afternoon in Corinne's conference room, watching a timeline she'd built on a whiteboard, dates in one color for the affair, dates in another for the trust access attempt, dates in a third for the attorney consultations, and I understood, finally, the full architecture of what I'd been living inside for over a year without seeing it. He had built a second family quietly enough to sustain for 3 years. He had begun exit planning of his own 4 months before my diagnosis, likely because the business debt from supporting 2 households had become unsustainable, and he needed to know his options. My diagnosis had arrived, and, rather than derail his plan, had handed him a version of it that was financially better for him, if he played it patiently, staying married long enough to gain broader access to my father's trust, either through my incapacity, or, I have to say this plainly because Corinne made me sit with the possibility, even though I never got proof either way, through my death, at which point, under our original 9-year-old will, he would have inherited a portion of the trust's income directly. The final confrontation happened at our kitchen table, the same table where the healthcare proxy folder had once sat the night before my surgery. 6 months after that night, my hair just beginning to grow back in soft dark inches, I kept touching without, and he'd made most of those decisions already, whether he meant to or not. The legal and financial consequences unfolded over the following year with the specific unglamorous slowness real consequences usually have. The forged authorization form became part of a formal fraud complaint filed with the trust's custodian, who confirmed independently that the signature didn't match verified samples on file, closing that account access permanently and referring the matter per their own compliance policy for further review. Peter did not face criminal charges for the forgery. The custodian's investigation concluded it couldn't establish beyond their internal threshold whether he had signed it himself or directed someone else to, and Corrine advised me that pursuing it further would cost more in time and legal fees during my recovery than it was likely to yield, a piece of practical wisdom I accepted with less peace than I expected to feel. The divorce settlement, when it finalized, treated the vendor payments to Renata's household as marital waste, dissipation of shared assets for the benefit of a third party, which meant a portion of Donovan Build Group's value, once independently appraised, was credited back to me in the settlement, rather than split, as though those years of diverted income had never happened. My father's trust, protected the whole time by a clause I'd once thought excessive, was never legally part of the marital estate at all, and stayed exactly where it had allowed. Ace belonged entirely mine. The emotional justice, if I can call it that, didn't look like triumph. It looked like a Tuesday morning 8 months after the confrontation, sitting in Ansell's office to sign the final documents removing Peter, as any kind of contingent beneficiary or fiduciary from every piece of paper that touched my life, my will, my healthcare directive, my father's trust, and feeling something settle in my chest that wasn't happiness exactly, but was close enough to relief that I let myself sit with it for a long minute before I picked up the pen. I told Sophie the full truth in stages, over that same 8 months, giving her only as much as I thought she could carry at each point, the separation first, then the reason for it in general terms, and finally, closer to her 16th birthday, the fact of her half-sister's existence, because I decided a secret that size shouldn't be one she discovers by accident the way I had discovered mine on a kitchen tablet. She was quiet for a long time after I told her that part, and then she asked whether it made her a bad person that she was angry at a baby who hadn't done anything wrong. I told her it didn't, that anger doesn't always aim itself fairly, and that was allowed, as long as she didn't let it decide who she became. She asked me once, carefully, whether I hated her father, and I told her the truth, which is that I don't have room left for hatred, only for the specific discipline of making sure nothing like this reminded you that the fine print matters most exactly when you're too tired to read it. Take a minute this week and actually look at who's named on your own documents. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.